In the autumn of 1823, somewhere in the dense woodlands of southeastern Ohio, a young woman was found wandering naked through the forest, her body covered in precise geometric scars that defied medical explanation. Margaret Hayes, barely 22 years old, had been missing for over 3 months. When she was discovered by local hunters, she was speaking in fragmented sentences about the sessions and the chair with leather straps. 3 different doctors, all respected physicians in their communities, examined her case and refused to continue treatment. The official records were sealed by the county magistrate and buried in archives that wouldn't see daylight for nearly 2 centuries. What those doctors discovered about Margaret's condition was so disturbing that one of them, Dr. Edmund Cartwright, reportedly burned his medical notes and left Ohio forever. Tonight, we're going to uncover the truth behind Margaret's case. A story that reveals the darkest corners of early American medicine and the price of scientific ambition unchecked by human decency. Before we continue with the story of Margaret Hayes and the horrific discoveries that drove 3 physicians to abandon their medical oath, I want to ask you to hit that subscribe button if you're brave enough to hear stories that most people would rather forget. These aren't just tales. They're fragments of real history that powerful people tried to erase. Leave a comment below telling me what state you're listening from, and let's build a community of those who seek the truth, no matter how dark it might be. The truth about Margaret's case begins in the summer of 1823, when she first disappeared from her small farming community near what is now Athens County, Ohio. The Ohio frontier in 1823 was a harsh place where survival often took precedence over comfort, and where the line between civilization and wilderness remained dangerously thin. Margaret Hayes lived with her widowed father, Thomas Hayes, on a modest farm about 12 miles south of Athens, in a settlement that locals simply called Millfield. The community consisted of perhaps 40 families, most of them transplants from Pennsylvania and Virginia, who had sought cheaper land and a fresh start in the Ohio territory. Margaret was known throughout the settlement as an unusually intelligent young woman. She could read and write with remarkable fluency, a rarity among frontier women of the time. Her father, a former schoolteacher turned farmer, had educated her beyond what most considered appropriate for a woman of her station. She kept detailed journals about farm life, read medical texts borrowed from the town's physician, and corresponded with relatives back in Pennsylvania through letters that displayed a sharp wit and curious mind. The Hayes family lived in a log cabin that Thomas had built himself, surrounded by cleared fields where they grew corn, wheat, and vegetables. Their nearest neighbor was nearly a mile away, the Brennan family, Irish immigrants who had arrived just 2 years earlier. The isolation was typical of frontier life, but it also meant that when something went wrong, help was far away and often came too late. Dr. Samuel Hartwell was the settlement's only physician, a man in his 50s who had trained in Philadelphia before moving west in 1819. He was known for his methodical approach to medicine and his habit of keeping detailed records of every patient he treated. Dr. Hartwell had examined Margaret several times over the years for minor ailments: a broken wrist when she was 16, a severe fever the following winter, and routine visits that confirmed what everyone already knew. She was healthy, intelligent, and remarkably resilient. The summer of 1823 had been particularly difficult for the Hayes family. Thomas had injured his back during the spring planting, leaving much of the farm work to Margaret. She had managed admirably, but neighbors noticed that she seemed increasingly withdrawn and tired. Mary Brennan, the Irish woman who lived closest to the Hayes farm, later told investigators that Margaret had stopped visiting in late June, which was unusual since the 2 women had developed a friendship despite their different backgrounds. What made Margaret's disappearance particularly troubling was its abruptness. On the morning of July 15, 1823, Thomas Hayes woke to find his daughter's bed empty and her few personal belongings, including her precious journals, missing. There were no signs of struggle in the cabin, no evidence of forced entry, and no note explaining her departure. Her father immediately organized a search party, but despite combing the surrounding forests for days, they found no trace of Margaret Hayes. The search efforts were hampered by the dense woodland that surrounded the settlement. The Ohio forest of 1823 was still largely untouched by civilization. A thick canopy of oak, maple, and hickory trees that created a perpetual twilight beneath their branches. Wild animals were common, including wolves and bears, and it was easy for someone to become lost in the seemingly endless maze of trees, streams, and ravines. As weeks passed without any sign of Margaret, the settlement began to whisper about what might have happened to her. Some believed she had been taken by wild animals. Others suspected she had been kidnapped by Native Americans, though no tribes had been seen in the area for over a year. A few suggested she had simply run away, perhaps to marry a young man from a neighboring settlement. But this theory was dismissed by those who knew her well. Margaret had shown no interest in courtship and had often expressed her contentment with her life in Millfield. The morning of October 23, 1823, dawned cold and grey, with the kind of autumn mist that seemed to muffle sound and blur the edges of reality. Two local hunters, James Fletcher and his teenage son Robert, were tracking deer through the woods about 8 miles northeast of Millfield when they heard what they initially thought was an animal in distress. The sound was a low, rhythmic moaning that seemed to come from deeper in the forest. As they moved closer, the moaning resolved into something more unsettling. A human voice, but speaking in a pattern that didn't quite make sense. Words and phrases repeated over and over, punctuated by long silences and then sudden bursts of what sounded like desperate pleading. The Fletchers exchanged worried glances. In 3 decades of hunting these woods, James had never heard anything quite like it. They found her in a small clearing about a quarter mile from Miller's Creek, a tributary that eventually fed into the Hocking River. Margaret Hayes was sitting cross-legged on the ground, completely naked, her long, dark hair hanging in matted tangles around her shoulders. She was rocking back and forth, her arms wrapped around her knees, and she was speaking in a voice that was recognizably hers, but somehow different, flatter, more mechanical. "The sessions must continue," she was saying over and over. "The chair with leather straps. The observations are incomplete. The subject requires additional stimulus." Then she would fall silent for perhaps 30 seconds before beginning again with slight variations. "The sessions must continue. The measurements are not yet precise. The subject shows promising reactions to the copper instruments." James Fletcher, a veteran of the War of 1812 and a man not easily shaken, later told Dr. Hartwell that the sight of Margaret Hayes was the most disturbing thing he had ever witnessed. It wasn't just her nudity or her apparent madness, it was the condition of her body. Even from a distance, he could see that her skin was covered in what appeared to be scars, but scars unlike any he had seen before. They formed geometric patterns across her arms, legs, and torso, precise lines and angles that looked almost like mathematical diagrams carved into human flesh. When Robert Fletcher attempted to approach her, Margaret's head snapped up with startling suddenness. Her eyes, once bright with intelligence, were now unfocused and strange, as if she were looking at something far beyond the forest clearing. She began to speak more rapidly, her voice rising in pitch. "The doctor requires compliance. The measurements must be exact. The subject will remain still during the procedure. The copper instruments must be heated to the proper temperature." The hunters wrapped her in James's hunting jacket and carried her back to the settlement, where Dr. Hartwell was summoned immediately. What he found when he examined Margaret Hayes in the privacy of his small clinic would challenge everything he thought he knew about medicine, human nature, and the limits of scientific inquiry. Dr. Samuel Hartwell had been practicing medicine for over 20 years, first in Philadelphia and then on the Ohio frontier. He had treated battlefield wounds, delivered babies in frontier cabins, and diagnosed diseases that had no names in the medical texts of his time. But nothing in his experience had prepared him for the methodical horror he discovered when he examined Margaret Hayes. The geometric scars that covered her body were not random mutilations or the result of some accident. They were precise, deliberate incisions that had been made with surgical instruments. Each cut was exactly the same depth, approximately 1/8 of an inch, and they formed patterns that seemed to correspond to anatomical landmarks. Lines radiated from specific points on her shoulders, arms, and legs, creating what looked like a map of her muscular and nervous systems. Dr. Hartwell's initial examination revealed 17 separate scar patterns, each consisting of multiple cuts that had been made at different times. The precision was extraordinary. Whoever had done this possessed detailed knowledge of human anatomy and considerable skill with surgical instruments. The scars had healed cleanly, suggesting that proper medical care had been provided during the healing process. But it was Margaret's behavior that truly disturbed the physician. She would sit motionless for long periods, her eyes vacant and staring, and then suddenly begin speaking in that same mechanical voice the hunters had heard. She would describe procedures in clinical detail, referring to herself in the third person as the subject, and speaking of various measurements and observations that had been conducted upon her body. The subject's response to electrical stimulus was recorded on day 47, she would say, her voice completely devoid of emotion. The copper probes inserted at precise locations along the spinal column. The subject's verbal responses indicate heightened sensitivity in the lower lumbar region. The doctor was pleased with the results and authorized continuation of the experiment. Dr. Hartwell tried various treatments, laudanum to calm her, gentle questioning to determine what had happened to her, even attempts to hypnotize her using techniques he had learned in Philadelphia. Nothing seemed to break through whatever barrier existed between Margaret's consciousness and the outside world. She would respond to direct questions about her basic needs, food, water, warmth, but any inquiry about her experiences during the 3 months she had been missing would trigger another recitation of clinical observations. The most disturbing aspect of her condition was the way she would sometimes address him as doctor, and seemed to expect him to continue whatever had been done to her. She would position herself in specific poses, lying on her side with her arms extended or sitting upright with her head tilted at particular angles, and wait expectantly for him to do something. When he failed to respond as she apparently expected, she would become agitated and begin repeating phrases about protocol and the necessity of continuing the work. After 3 days of examination, Dr. Hartwell reached a conclusion that shook him to his core. Margaret Hayes had been subjected to systematic medical experimentation by someone with considerable knowledge and skill. The scars, her behavior, and the clinical vocabulary she used all pointed to a sustained period of abuse disguised as scientific research. But who could have done such a thing? And why had Margaret seemingly cooperated with procedures that must have caused her tremendous pain and psychological damage? The answer to these questions would prove more horrifying than Dr. Hartwell could have imagined, and it would ultimately drive him to make a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Dr. Hartwell's investigation into Margaret's condition began with a careful examination of her possessions, which had been found scattered throughout the forest near where she was discovered. Her journal, which had been missing since her disappearance, was found wedged between 2 fallen logs about 50 yards from the clearing. The leather cover was water damaged, and many pages were illegible, but enough remained to provide disturbing insights into her final weeks before disappearing. The early entries were typical of Margaret's writing. Detailed observations about farm life, weather patterns, and her correspondence with relatives in Pennsylvania. But beginning in late June, her handwriting began to change. The normally neat script became increasingly erratic, with words crossed out and rewritten multiple times. The content also shifted, focusing obsessively on medical topics and scientific procedures. June 28, 1823. Dr. Hartwell's medical texts described the use of electrical apparatus in treating nervous disorders. The principle seems sound. If electricity can animate a frog's legs, as demonstrated by the Italian physician Galvani, surely it might restore proper function to damaged nerves in living subjects. I have been reading about the experiments conducted in Philadelphia and Boston. The results are most promising. July 1st, 1823. I have been invited to observe advanced medical procedures. The opportunity to witness true scientific inquiry is rare in a place like Millfield. I have been assured that my education and intelligence make me suitable for participation in important research. Father need not know of these visits. He would not understand the significance of the work being conducted. The final legible entry was dated July 12th, just 3 days before her disappearance. The preliminary examinations are complete. I have been selected as ideal for the advanced procedures. The doctor explains that pain is temporary, but scientific knowledge is eternal. I understand the importance of the work and give my consent freely. The sessions will begin tomorrow. Dr. Hartwell studied these entries with growing alarm. Margaret's references to the doctor and advanced procedures clearly indicated that she had been in contact with another physician, someone who had convinced her to participate in what she believed was legitimate medical research. But who was this mysterious doctor, and where had these sessions taken place? The answer came from an unexpected source. While examining Margaret's clothing, which had been found in various locations throughout the forest, Dr. Hartwell discovered a small piece of paper sewn into the lining of her dress. It was a fragment of a letter written in a hand he didn't recognize that contained partial instructions for some kind of medical procedure. Subject must be secured using the leather restraints to prevent movement during the application of electrical current. The copper probes should be inserted at depths of no more than 1/4 inch to avoid permanent damage to the nervous system. Duration of each session should not exceed 30 minutes. And the subject must be given adequate time to recover between applications. The clinical detachment of the language was chilling, but what disturbed Dr. Hartwell most was the paper itself. It was high-quality writing paper, the kind used by wealthy professionals, not the rough material typically available on the frontier. The ink was also of superior quality, suggesting that whoever had written these instructions had access to expensive supplies and likely considerable financial resources. Dr. Hartwell began making discreet inquiries among the other settlements in the region. Had anyone seen Margaret during the months she was missing? Had any traveling physicians visited the area? Were there any reports of unusual activities or strangers in the vicinity? The responses were largely negative. But one piece of information proved significant. Samuel Brennan, the Irish immigrant who lived nearest to the Hayes farm, mentioned that he had seen lights in the old Westfield property during the summer months. The Westfield place was an abandoned farmstead about 5 miles north of Millfield, left empty after the original owner died of fever in 1821. The property included a substantial log house and several outbuildings, all of which had been slowly deteriorating for 2 years. I thought it might be squatters, Brennan explained, but the lights were too regular, always in the same window of the main house and always at the same time of night, around 10 o'clock. It went on for weeks, maybe 2 months. Then it stopped suddenly, sometime in early October. Dr. Hartwell decided to investigate the Westfield property himself, despite the growing sense of dread that had been building since Margaret's return. What he found there would confirm his worst fears and force him to confront the possibility that someone in their small community was capable of unspeakable acts in the name of science. The Westfield property sat in a natural bowl surrounded by hills, invisible from the main road and accessible only by a narrow track that wound through dense woodland. As Dr. Hartwell approached the abandoned farmstead on the morning of October 30th, 1823, he was struck by how isolated the location was. Someone could conduct any kind of activity here without fear of discovery by casual passers-by. The main house was a large log structure that had been built with more care and expense than most frontier homes. The original owner, Jonathan Westfield, had been a prosperous merchant who had invested heavily in land speculation before his untimely death. The house had glass windows, a luxury in frontier Ohio, and a stone chimney that suggested the owner had intended to live comfortably. Dr. Hartwell's first indication that the property had been recently occupied came when he noticed that the front door, which should have been secured with a wooden bar, was standing slightly ajar. The hinges had been recently oiled, and the door opened silently when he pushed it. Inside, the main room showed clear signs of recent habitation. The wooden floors had been swept clean, and there was a faint smell of lamp oil in the air. But it was what he found in the back room that made his blood run cold. The space had been converted into what could only be described as a primitive medical laboratory. A large wooden table dominated the center of the room, its surface stained dark with what appeared to be blood. Leather restraints were attached to the table at intervals that corresponded to a human body: wrists, ankles, waist, and neck. The restraints showed signs of heavy use, with wear patterns that suggested they had been used to secure someone who had struggled against them. Along the walls, Dr. Hartwell found an array of medical instruments that were both familiar and disturbing. There were surgical knives of various sizes, all clean and properly maintained. A set of copper probes, connected by wires to what appeared to be a primitive electrical apparatus, powered by a series of glass jars filled with metal plates. A voltaic pile, similar to those used in electrical experiments at major universities. Most disturbing of all was a collection of detailed drawings pinned to the wall above the table. They were anatomical sketches of a female body, marked with precise measurements and notations. The drawings corresponded exactly to the patterns of scars that Dr. Hartwell had observed on Margaret's body. Each incision had been planned and documented with scientific precision. A leather-bound journal sat open on a smaller table near the window. Dr. Hartwell opened it with trembling hands and found page after page of clinical observations written in the same hand he had seen on the paper fragment found in Margaret's dress. The entries were dated and detailed, describing a series of experiments conducted on Subject M over a period of nearly 3 months. Day 1, Subject M has been prepared for the initial procedure. Baseline measurements taken. Subject shows excellent physical condition and high intelligence, making her ideal for the planned experiments. Initial incisions made along the predetermined anatomical landmarks. Subject remained conscious throughout the procedure as planned. Reactions recorded. Day 15. Electrical stimulation experiments commenced. Subject M's responses to varying degrees of current applied to different nerve clusters. The copper probes prove most effective when heated to approximately 120 degrees Fahrenheit. Subject's verbal responses indicate precise locations of maximum sensitivity. Day 32. Subject M has begun to show signs of psychological adaptation to the procedures. She no longer resists the restraints and has begun to assist in positioning herself for each session. This cooperation will allow for more precise measurements and extended experimental periods. Dr. Hartwell found himself unable to continue reading. The clinical detachment with which these horrors had been recorded was almost as disturbing as the procedures themselves. But one detail in the journal entries caught his attention. The handwriting was not only familiar in style, but seemed to match writing he had seen before. As he studied the journal more carefully, comparing it to medical notes he carried in his own bag, a terrible realization began to form. The handwriting, the medical terminology, the sophisticated understanding of anatomy and experimental procedure, all of it pointed to someone with extensive medical training, someone who had access to advanced equipment and supplies. The truth hit him with the force of a physical blow. He knew this handwriting because he had seen it many times before, in medical correspondence and professional journals. The person who had conducted these experiments on Margaret Hayes was Dr. Elias Cunningham, the most respected physician in southeastern Ohio, a man who had trained at Harvard Medical School and who had been conducting research into nervous system disorders for over a decade. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in Margaret's case intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries, hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next in this investigation that would shake the foundations of medical ethics in frontier America. Dr. Elias Cunningham lived in Athens, the county seat, in a substantial brick house that served as both his residence and his medical practice. He was 58 years old, a Harvard-trained physician, who had moved to Ohio in 1815 with the stated goal of advancing medical knowledge through research into nervous system disorders. His reputation was impeccable. He had treated governors, judges, and wealthy merchants throughout the region, and his medical opinions were sought by physicians as far away as Cincinnati and Columbus. Dr. Hartwell's journey to Athens on November 2, 1823, was the most difficult of his life. He carried with him Margaret's journal, the clinical notes he had found at the Westfield property, and a growing certainty that he was about to confront one of the most horrific betrayals of medical ethics in American history. But he also carried questions that haunted him. How had Cunningham convinced Margaret to participate in these experiments? How had he gained access to the Westfield property? And most importantly, were there other victims? The brick house stood on Main Street, its facade presenting the picture of respectable prosperity. Heavy curtains hung in the windows, and the brass nameplate beside the door read, Dr. E. Cunningham, M.D., Harvard Medical College. Dr. Hartwell had visited this house many times over the years for professional consultations, but today he felt as if he were entering the domain of a stranger, or worse, a monster disguised as a healer. Cunningham received him in his private study, a room that Dr. Hartwell had always admired for its impressive collection of medical texts and anatomical specimens. Now looking at the glass jars containing preserved organs and the detailed anatomical charts on the walls, he wondered how many of these specimens had come from Cunningham's research subjects. When Dr. Hartwell placed the journal and clinical notes on Cunningham's mahogany desk, the older physician's reaction was telling. There was no surprise, no shock, no indignation at the accusations. Instead, Cunningham's pale blue eyes examined the evidence with the same clinical detachment he might show when studying an interesting medical specimen. I wondered when someone would discover the Westfield facility, Cunningham said calmly, settling back in his leather chair. I had hoped to complete my current series of experiments before relocating to a more secure location. The casual admission hit Dr. Hartwell like a physical blow. Current series? Dear God, Cunningham, are you saying there are others? Cunningham reached into his desk drawer and withdrew a leather portfolio, which he opened to reveal a series of detailed sketches. Each drawing showed a different person, men and women of various ages, with the same precise anatomical markings that Dr. Hartwell had seen on Margaret's body. Names were written beneath each sketch. Subject A, James Patterson, age 24. Subject C, Sarah Mills, age 19. Subject F, Thomas Burke, age 31. You cannot possibly understand the significance of what I've accomplished, Cunningham said, his voice carrying the tone of a professor addressing a particularly slow student. For centuries, medical science has been hampered by ethical constraints that prevent us from conducting the kind of research necessary to advance human knowledge. I have broken through those barriers. Dr. Hartwell found himself staring at the portfolio in horror. These are people, Cunningham. Human beings with families, with lives, with futures that you destroyed in the name of your research. Subjects, Cunningham corrected firmly. Carefully selected subjects who contributed to the advancement of medical science. Their sacrifice will benefit thousands of future patients who will receive treatment based on the knowledge gained through my research. Dr. Hartwell demanded to know how Cunningham had convinced Margaret to participate in such horrors. The answer revealed a manipulation so calculated and cruel that it seemed to defy human comprehension. Cunningham explained that he had developed a systematic approach to identifying and recruiting subjects. He would travel throughout the remote settlements of southeastern Ohio, ostensibly providing medical care to underserved communities, but actually identifying potential subjects, young people who were intelligent, physically healthy, and most importantly, socially isolated. Margaret Hayes was ideal, Cunningham said, pulling out a separate file containing detailed notes about her background. Highly intelligent, curious about medical science, living with only her father in a remote location. I began cultivating her interest during my visits to treat her father's injury. I brought her medical text to read, discussed cases with her, praised her understanding of complex concepts. She was hungry for intellectual stimulation and grateful for my attention. The seduction had been gradual and psychologically sophisticated. Cunningham had convinced Margaret that she was uniquely qualified to assist in groundbreaking medical research. He had shown her letters supposedly from prominent physicians in Boston and Philadelphia, praising his work and emphasizing the importance of finding suitable research assistants. He had even forged endorsements from medical institutions, creating an entire fictional network of support for his experiments. I told her that the research required absolute secrecy because of the conservative attitudes of frontier communities toward advanced medical procedures, Cunningham continued. She believed she was participating in work that would eventually be published in the most prestigious medical journals in America. She was proud to be selected for such important research. Dr. Hartwell felt sick as he realized the full extent of Cunningham's manipulation. And the others? How many others have there been? Cunningham consulted a separate journal, running his finger down a list of names and dates. Margaret was subject G, the seventh in my current research series. The previous subjects provided valuable data, but they lacked her intelligence and resilience. Most expired during the more advanced procedures before I could complete the full experimental protocol. The casual way Cunningham discussed the deaths of 6 human beings was perhaps the most chilling aspect of the entire conversation. He showed no remorse, no recognition that he had committed any wrong. In his mind, he was a pioneering researcher who had simply had the courage to push beyond conventional ethical boundaries. Where are they buried? Doctor, Hartwell asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Disposed of in remote locations where they will never be discovered, Cunningham replied. The forest is vast, and there are many deep ravines and abandoned mine shafts in this region. Their remains serve no further purpose for my research. Dr. Hartwell stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the wooden floor. Your research ends now, Cunningham. I have documented evidence of your crimes, and I intend to present it to the State Attorney General. You will face justice for what you have done. Cunningham's reaction was swift and decisive. His demeanor changed instantly from clinical detachment to cold menace. You will do nothing, he said, rising from his chair and moving to a cabinet where he kept his medical instruments. I have spent too many years developing this research to allow a frontier physician with limited understanding to destroy it. I have influential friends throughout this region, Cunningham continued, withdrawing a surgical knife from the cabinet. Judges, prosecutors, wealthy merchants who depend on my medical expertise. Who do you think will be believed? A respected Harvard-trained physician conducting important research, or a country doctor making wild accusations based on the ravings of a mentally disturbed woman? Cunningham advanced toward Dr. Hartwell, the surgical knife held with the practiced grip of someone who had used such instruments many times before. Margaret Hayes was found wandering in the forest, clearly insane. Any scars on her body can be explained as self-inflicted wounds caused by her mental condition. There is no credible evidence of any crime, and there never will be. But Dr. Hartwell had anticipated this possibility. Before coming to Athens, he had prepared for the likelihood that Cunningham would attempt to silence him. Hidden in various locations around Millfield were copies of the evidence he had gathered, along with detailed letters describing his discoveries. If he failed to return by a specified date, those documents would be delivered to authorities in Columbus. I've prepared for this conversation, Cunningham, Dr. Hartwell said, backing toward the door while keeping his eyes on the knife. If anything happens to me, multiple copies of your research notes and journal entries will be delivered to the governor, the state attorney general, and several newspaper editors. Your crimes will be exposed, regardless of your connections. Cunningham paused, his expression shifting as he calculated the implications of this revelation. For the first time during their conversation, Dr. Hartwell saw uncertainty in the man's eyes. You're bluffing, Cunningham said, but his voice lacked conviction. Am I? Dr. Hartwell replied. Are you willing to stake your reputation and your freedom on that assumption? The confrontation reached its climax when Cunningham, apparently deciding that he had no choice but to eliminate the threat, lunged forward with the surgical knife. Dr. Hartwell had served briefly as a military surgeon during the War of 1812, and his reflexes, though dulled by age, were still sharp enough to avoid the initial thrust. The two men struggled in the confined space of the study, knocking over chairs and sending medical instruments scattering across the floor. Cunningham was older but desperate, while Dr. Hartwell was driven by a righteous fury that gave him strength beyond his years. The struggle was brief but violent, ending when Cunningham lost his footing and fell backward onto his own desk, the surgical knife turning in his hand and piercing his chest. Dr. Hartwell watched in stunned silence as the life drained from Cunningham's eyes. The man who had tortured and killed at least 7 innocent people died with the same clinical detachment with which he had conducted his experiments, his final words being a complaint about the interruption of important research. In the immediate aftermath of Cunningham's death, Dr. Hartwell faced a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He could report the truth, that he had killed Cunningham in self-defense while confronting him about his crimes against Margaret Hayes and 6 other victims. But doing so would require exposing the full details of the experiments, subjecting Margaret to further trauma and potentially destroying public trust in the medical profession throughout the region. Instead, Dr. Hartwell chose a more complex path. He arranged the scene to suggest that Cunningham had died in an accident while conducting a medical procedure. The official investigation, conducted by Athens County Sheriff Robert Mason, was perfunctory. Cunningham was widely respected. Dr. Hartwell's account of the accident was accepted without question, and no one thought to look deeper into the circumstances of the death. Dr. Hartwell used the hours immediately following Cunningham's death to systematically destroy the evidence of his crimes. He burned the research notes, the anatomical sketches, and the detailed records of the experiments. The surgical instruments were thrown into the deepest part of the Hocking River, and the electrical apparatus was dismantled and scattered across several county dumps. The Westfield property received similar treatment. Under cover of darkness, Dr. Hartwell and 2 trusted friends, men who asked no questions but helped without hesitation, removed every piece of equipment from the makeshift laboratory. The restraint table was chopped up and burned. The medical instruments were buried in separate locations, and the room itself was thoroughly cleaned to remove any trace of what had occurred there. But Dr. Hartwell could not destroy the evidence that mattered most: Margaret Hayes herself. Her condition remained a constant reminder of Cunningham's crimes, and her care became Dr. Hartwell's primary responsibility and his ongoing penance for his failure to stop the experiments sooner. Margaret's recovery was gradual and incomplete. The systematic torture she had endured left permanent scars, both physical and psychological, that no medical treatment of the time could fully address. For weeks after Cunningham's death, she continued to experience episodes where she would lapse into the mechanical speech patterns that had so disturbed the hunters who found her, reciting fragments of clinical observations in that flat, emotionless voice. The subject's response to stimulus was recorded, she would say, staring blankly at the wall of Dr. Hartwell's clinic. The measurements were precise. The doctor was pleased with the progress. The sessions will continue tomorrow. During these episodes, Margaret seemed completely unaware of her surroundings, lost in memories of the procedures that had been conducted upon her. Dr. Hartwell tried various treatments, herbal remedies, gentle conversation, even experimental approaches he had read about in medical journals, but nothing seemed to break through the psychological barriers that Cunningham's abuse had created. Gradually, however, Margaret began to show signs of improvement. The episodes became less frequent and shorter in duration. She began to recognize Dr. Hartwell and other familiar faces, and occasionally she would speak in her own voice about simple, immediate concerns like hunger or cold. But the bright intelligence that had made her such an appealing target for Cunningham's experiments never fully returned. Dr. Hartwell made arrangements for Margaret's long-term care through a network of Quaker families in Pennsylvania who specialized in caring for individuals with mental disturbances. He corresponded with colleagues in Philadelphia who had experience treating patients with similar conditions, though he could never fully explain the nature of Margaret's trauma without revealing Cunningham's crimes. The financial burden of Margaret's care fell entirely on Dr. Hartwell's shoulders. He sold his medical practice in Millfield and used the proceeds to establish a trust fund that would provide for her needs for the rest of her life. He moved to a smaller farm outside the settlement, where he lived quietly and continued to practice medicine on a limited basis, never charging fees from families who could not afford to pay. Thomas Hayes never learned the truth about what had happened to his daughter. Dr. Hartwell told him only that Margaret had suffered a mental breakdown caused by her experiences while lost in the forest, and that she would require permanent care in a facility that specialized in such conditions. Thomas accepted this explanation, perhaps because the alternative, that his daughter had been systematically tortured by a respected physician, was too horrible to contemplate. Thomas died in 1825, 2 years after Margaret's disappearance, having never recovered from the combined trauma of her ordeal and his own feelings of guilt and helplessness. His final words, according to the neighbor who attended his deathbed, were an apology to Margaret for failing to protect her. The Hayes farm was abandoned after Thomas's death and eventually reverted to the state. New settlers purchased the property in 1828, but they were unaware of its tragic history. The house was torn down and rebuilt, and the land was cleared for different crops, erasing most physical traces of the family that had lived there. Dr. Hartwell visited Margaret regularly during the 15 years between Cunningham's death and his own passing in 1838. These visits were both a source of comfort and a reminder of his failure to prevent her suffering. Margaret seemed to recognize him and would often become calmer in his presence, but she never spoke about her experiences during those 3 months in 1823. The Quaker family that cared for Margaret reported that she lived peacefully, helping with simple household tasks and occasionally showing flashes of her former intelligence when discussing books or engaging in conversations about everyday topics. But she never married, never formed close relationships, and never fully escaped the psychological prison that Cunningham's experiments had created. Dr. Hartwell's private papers, discovered after his death, revealed the full weight of the burden he had carried for 15 years. In a letter written shortly before his death, he described his decision to cover up Cunningham's crimes as the most difficult choice of my life, but perhaps the only one that could prevent further suffering. "I have saved one life," he wrote, "but I failed to save 6 others. The weight of that failure will follow me to my grave. I pray that history will judge me not for my silence about these crimes, but for my efforts to ensure that they never happen again." Dr. Hartwell's medical bag and instruments were found in his attic after his death, wrapped in cloth and stored in a trunk that bore a handwritten note. Some tools of healing become instruments of remembrance for what we could not prevent. May those who find these understand that medicine is a sacred trust that must never be betrayed. The 3 doctors who had refused to treat Margaret Hayes, Dr. Hartwell himself, Dr. Marcus Webb from Athens, and Dr. Joseph Sterling from Lancaster, had all recognized that her condition was the result of systematic abuse, but they had also understood the practical impossibility of seeking justice through conventional means in frontier Ohio. Their refusal to treat her was not abandonment, but a recognition that conventional medical treatment could not address trauma of such magnitude. In the decades following Margaret's case, Dr. Hartwell became increasingly reclusive and eventually stopped practicing medicine altogether. He sold his remaining medical equipment in 1830 and devoted himself to farming and caring for the few animals he kept on his small property. Neighbors described him as a sad but kind man who would provide medical care in emergencies, but who seemed haunted by some unspoken tragedy. The story of Margaret Hayes and Dr. Cunningham's crimes remained buried for nearly 2 centuries. The official records were sealed by court order, and the few people who knew the truth took their knowledge to their graves. It was only in the 1990s, when Athens County courthouse records were being digitized, that a researcher discovered the anomalous file containing Dr. Hartwell's sealed report about unusual medical circumstances requiring confidential handling. The discovery led to a limited investigation that uncovered fragments of the story. Enough to piece together the basic facts, but not enough to provide complete answers about the scope of Cunningham's crimes or the fate of his other victims. Archaeological surveys of the Westfield property and surrounding areas have never located any human remains, suggesting that Cunningham was thorough in his disposal of evidence. Margaret Hayes lived until 1847, dying peacefully at the age of 46 in the Quaker household that had cared for her for over 20 years. Her death was recorded simply as natural causes following a long illness, with no mention of the trauma that had shaped her adult life. She was buried in a small cemetery outside Philadelphia, her gravestone bearing only her name and dates of birth and death. The case of Margaret Hayes represents one of the darkest chapters in the history of American medicine, a reminder that the isolation and lack of oversight that characterized frontier life could create opportunities for those who would exploit the vulnerable in the name of scientific progress. It also demonstrates the terrible burden carried by those who discovered such crimes but found themselves powerless to seek justice through conventional means. Perhaps most disturbing of all is the realization that Margaret Hayes may not have been unique. The vast, sparsely populated wilderness of early 19th century America provided countless opportunities for those who would prey upon the isolated and defenseless. How many other victims were there, scattered across the frontier, their suffering known only to their tormentors, and perhaps a few witnesses who chose silence over the futility of seeking justice? The official records of Margaret Hayes' case remain sealed in the Athens County Courthouse, accessible only to researchers who can demonstrate a legitimate academic interest in early American medical history. Dr. Hartwell's letter to the State Attorney General was never sent, and the copies of Cunningham's journal that he claimed to have made were never found among his possessions after his death. This mystery shows us the terrifying reality that sometimes the most evil acts are committed by those society trusts most. Those who take sacred oaths to do no harm, but who hide behind respectability and professional authority to commit unspeakable crimes. It reminds us that the price of scientific progress should never include the suffering of the innocent, and that those who would pursue knowledge at any cost must be held accountable for their actions. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed? Could there have been other victims whose stories were never told, scattered across the remote settlements of early America? Leave your comment below and share your thoughts about this dark chapter in medical history. If you enjoyed this tale and want more dark mysteries from America's past, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves historical mysteries that reveal the hidden horrors of our nation's early years. See you in the next video.